Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan and her entourage at the Union buildings yesterday. The main aim was to strengthen cooperation in trade and investment, as well as infrastructure and transport, among other things. Already, trading between the two countries exceeds 8 billion rand. To tell us more about the outcome of the visit, I'm joined by Stavros Nicolaou from the Business Unity South Africa. Mr. Nicolaou, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA. Now, of course, it's shown since 2020 that 23% of South Africa's world exports and 11% of the world imports were intra-Africa. But also, it looks like South Africa's exports to Africa declined by 70% since that year. So I guess it's very important, this state visit, to make sure that we strengthen that and see a growth in our intra-trade.
Yeah, firstly, thanks very much for having me on. So yesterday I participated in two capacities. I mean, the primary capacity was in my Aspen Pharmacare capacity. Aspen is one of the largest pharmaceutical investors in Tanzania. And I think of particular interest yesterday was that since 1994, and it's always important to look at these trade statistics, bilateral trade, in other words, from South Africa to Tanzania and the reverse, have grown by several hundreds of percent. So that was the first important observation. I think the second thing is that these state visits, which have a particular business focus, are also intended in achieving other objectives. So if I may just raise one of the key objectives yesterday was not only to strengthen bilateral ties and investment and economic collaboration between the two countries, but also this is a further stepping stone to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And we will be hosting in South Africa in April the Continental Summit aimed at growing intra-African trade. But also very important, because if we cast our minds back to COVID, where the continent was scurrying around trying to get vaccines from all sorts of places and couldn't, this agreement aims to aggregate the volumes of Africa so that Africa can place itself in a better negotiating position in the first instance. But in the second instance, if you aggregate volumes, you get economies of scale on the continent. And in our context, it's very interesting for Aspen, of course, because we are looking to produce vaccines for the continent. So the more you aggregate those volumes, the better you get economies of scale on the continent, and the better you are you are better able to respond to pandemics, but also to industrialize the continent, which has to remain a key focus for the continent.
And you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is an agreement that we're supposed to meet to have this African continent that we want that is stronger together, right? That's the whole, aim of it by 2063. That is, in about 40 years' time or so. And some people would say it's far away. But do you think we'll meet that, especially looking at how the African continent, for instance, some of our problems when it comes to trade is also infrastructure development and how slow that has been for us?
Look, I think every massive journey begins with a small step, right? And I think we've got to start somewhere. And clearly what we cannot continue to do as a continent is we cannot continue to be a serial importer of even the most basic products and services. I mentioned healthcare earlier. Yesterday there was a focus on agriculture, on mining. There was a focus on infrastructure and energy. So there were core areas of focus, but none of this is, of course, achievable unless you take that first step, and taking that first step is a meaningful step. So yesterday was, yes, about strengthening the ties between our two countries, and there's a significant historical tie, to the extent that even our national anthems are very similar. But to take it to the next level, the economic collaboration is where the focus needs to be, and that needs to morph out into a more continental agenda. And I think both presidents yesterday and both trade ministers were very clear on that. Strengthen bilateral ties, but we need to get the continent to industrialize and be less dependent on imports. I mean, healthcare, for example, we have the worst disease burden of any continent in the world, but yet we import most of our pharmaceuticals. That's counterintuitive, doesn't make any sense. So we need to get these volumes so we can produce our own pharmaceuticals and vaccines on the continent.
And I mean, I remember when you talk about health, there was a point when President Cyril Ramaphosa, when he was still AU chair, had to go out there to the international world and literally beg them in terms of patencies, just so that Africa can also be saved, or the lives of Africans can also be saved during the height of COVID-19. But, you know, the president also visited Tanzania back in 2019. It was one of his very first state visits during the former president's tenure. And that was also to strengthen our bilateral agreements and our bilateral ties. Since then till today, has there been any improvement between Tanzania and South Africa?
Look, we're all obviously slightly afflicted by the COVID period. I mean, that had a significant economic impact on every single continent. So I think one needs to measure a 5-year period rather than just look at what happened in the most recent times, because you're going to get a distorted picture. So the 5-year consideration and the longer consideration, which I spoke from 1994 onwards, so from 94 onwards, there's been several hundreds% growth in trade, and there's been bilateral investment which never existed previously. I mean, Aspen, for example, has made a significant, in Eastern African terms or East Africa terms, a significant investment in that part of the world. Now, that would not be possible if we did not have these cordial bilateral and economic collaborative relations with our counterparts in Tanzania. So a short answer is yes, there has been growth. Can we do a lot more? Of course we can. And that was a particular focus yesterday, and something that rolled off the tongues of both presidents quite freely.
And just lastly, you know, when it comes to these meetings, do anyone in the businesses of the other countries that we would be hosting, or that our president would be hosting, you know, bring up the issue of trade being more slanted to South Africa's favor? In most cases, for instance, even with a country such as Kenya or Uganda, the Ugandan president was also hosted here, and even Tanzania. It's mostly South Africa that exports more than that country would be importing to us.
Yeah, so these conversations are really based on what we call complementarity, so finding synergies and complementarities. Because in all of these relationships, you're never going to have a perfect balance of trade. I mean, there's always going to be one partner that is slightly more dominant than the other. But what's important is to find those complementary sectors and or complementary products that you can look to grow. And part of that growth trajectory is how do we work together to strengthen intra-African trade, but also to create export opportunities out of these two countries. You can only do that if there's a good economic understanding that you're doing it on a complementary basis rather than a competitive one.
All right, Mr. Stavros Nicolaou from Business Unity South Africa, thank you very much for your time here on eNCA.